Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Alicia Hall, Programs and Events Manager at the p.g.a, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this Q&A today with the producing team behind The Luckiest Girl Alive. Joining us for this conversation today is producer Bruna Papandrea, producer Erik Feig, actress producer Mila Kunis, and producer Jeanne Snow. All four panelists have received the producer's mark on this film. Before we get started, we'd like to say a quick thank you to Netflix for making today's panel possible. Leading this conversation, please join me in welcoming Hannah Minghella. After 14 years as president of TriStar Pictures, Hannah currently serves as the president of motion pictures at Bad Robot for J.J. Abrams and Katie McGrath. Hannah most recently produced a global hit movie on Netflix, Lou, starring Allison Janney and Journey Smollett, and the upcoming animated movie, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. She's currently in production on the Blue Angels documentary for IMAX and developing the next Superman movie with Ta-Nehisi Coates for DC WB. Hannah, thank you for being here, and I'll turn this conversation over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I am thrilled, having just had the opportunity to watch this film and just truly moved and inspired, and just can't wait to dig into a conversation about this film, because it tackles so much and topics that are not easy to tackle, and certainly not easy to tackle in a way that ends up being sort of empowering and also thoughtful and thought-provoking and entertaining. And that's kind of the magic trick, I think, of this movie that you've all made. So it's my pleasure to be talking to the producing team here, and obviously lead actor Mila, but alongside Erik, Bruna, and Jeanne. Thank you for having me here. I'm so curious, because no movie is ever easy to make, and the story of making a movie is oftentimes as interesting as the movie itself. And I know that this film had its own path to its release, and I'm just so curious. I'd love to start at the beginning and how this movie came to be and how you all came to be together. I think, if memory serves, Erik, you were at Lionsgate when you originally bought the film. So I'd love to start at the beginning with how you got here.
I think if we were going to begin truly chronologically, it begins with Jeanne, who is the very first person along this timeline of getting into contact with this great property. And I come in, but I think I'm third in our timeline. Do you want us to go first?
Well, me and Bruna, right? I mean, I remember Michelle Weiner sending us the manuscript, and I think we got it right before the holiday break. And I remember just reading it, and I think Bruna and I were like racing to finish the book, as we usually do. And I remember having to get up from my Christmas Eve dinner. I was like, sorry, family, I got to go to my room and I got to finish this book because I love it so, so much. And the tone was so unique and the voice was so unique. And I think Bruna and I just knew it was a movie we absolutely had to make. And then Bruna, from there, I think, is that when we set it up with Lionsgate?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm like reminiscing, because Jeanne and I, like, when we love something, we kind of race to finish it. And I'm generally faster than her, I like to say, but that's not true. But it is that thing. That's kind of that's the beginning of how, right? Maybe want to adapt a book, is you have a conversation with someone else who is having the same experience. Like, you cannot stop thinking about it. You can't stop reading it. And you can't wait to see it dramatized. And yes, that was the beginning of how we decided to acquire the rights and sold it to Erik at the time, who'd always been a massive supporter of mine, even actually when I made one of my first movies on my own, Warm Bodies. And I think he saw what we saw. And I can let you take the next step, because it's kind of great how you became part of our producing team.
Yeah, I mean, so Bruna and I have had a long and great relationship. And I also always love, Warm Bodies was another movie, but also one that very close to our hearts. We had a wonderful experience, and we're always looking to find new stuff. And I just know, Bruna and Jeanne, but they have great taste, So when Bruna told me about the book, I was like, great, let me read it. And who's not here as well is Naruki Reshadari, who was my executive at Lionsgate, had been working with me, and then ultimately actually went to Netflix. So remember that detail, but at the time she was there, and she and we had the same kind of dynamic that Bruna and Jeanne did, which is, this is good, let's read it quickly and see what we think. So we both loved it. reached out. I reached out to Bruna and loved it. That was great. At the time, and I've worked a lot on book adaptations, which I really, really love, you know, and trying to kind of like, I mean, Warm Bodies is based on a book, and then obviously many other ones that I've worked on in the past. But with this one, Jessica Knoll, the novelist, was attached to adapt as well. So as part of picking up the book, it was also, she is going to adapt. How do we feel about that? You know, and she's never written, this is her first novel. She never written a screenplay before. And I remember that, I don't remember the exact timing, but as the next step of saying, yes, I want to work on this. Yes, we want to develop this. Don't worry about the green light models. We'll deal with that later on. It was kind of getting sort of Jessica comfortable that we were the right home for it at the time as a studio, and that she would want to work with me and with us as a you know, sort of budding or first time screenwriter. So I remember I was going to be in New York like that week or that next week by happenstance, and I met her for coffee before we had the rights. And it was like the audition process to see if she was into working with us. And then she said yes, and then we picked it up and developed it. Did a long time with it. I'll skip to the very end, which is toward the end of my Leaving Lionsgate, right before that, Naoki left, went to Netflix, became an executive, and then I left and launched Picture Start, and then reached back out to Bruna saying, let's work on this. You know, I didn't, you know, I thought there would be an opportunity to pluck it from the shelf at the studio, let's say. And we also knew that Naoki was a great fan of the movie at Netflix, so that would be a sort of nice reunion of it. And that's kind of how it all kind of came back together in a very like incredibly familial, organic way.
That's great. And Mila, sort of, do you remember, I mean, I'm sure you do, because it's such a singular piece of writing. Do you remember the first time you read the book, or what you thought when you first read it? And how did that sit with you?
I mean, honestly, I think I read the book when it first came out, which at this point probably is 6-7 years ago. So it was, I liked it. To be honest, when I got the script, I looked at the title and I was like, well, this title seems so familiar. So I Googled it because I thought maybe I had read the script in a previous like reincarnation of it. And then the book, the front cover popped up and I was like, oh, I know this one. And I remember going, what's the twist? Like I couldn't remember what it was. I remembered one of them, but I couldn't remember the second one. So when I read the script, I forgot there's like a whole second part to it. And so I'd like to say I read the script with fresh eyes, and then I went back and reread the book after I'd read the script. So I'd read the book twice in between reading the script.
Yeah. I'm curious because I mean, Erik, you touched on this already, but it's not often that the author of a book adapts their own work. And I think in this case, because Annie has such a singular voice, and I wonder, was it sort of almost essential that Jessica do it herself? And what was that process like, you know, working with an author writing her debut screenplay?
Yeah, she has such a strong voice. I mean, it's also when you meet her as well, she has, she's so smart. She's so, I mean, it sounds so stupid to say like well-spoken or articulate, but she's so insightful in the way and so incisive, you know, crystal clear. And it comes across obviously in the book. And it's a complicated book to adapt for anyone, for the most seasoned screenwriter, because there are sort of three voices going on at once. Contemporary Ani, past Tiffany, and then the voiceover, you know, as sort of a third character, really, honestly. Mm-hmm. And it's so many different timelines. So it's a very tricky assignment. It felt like, okay, great. If she wants to do it, she should do it. And she wanted to do it. And she really kind of put her all in. And she also, one of the things I thought was great and amazing and very, very impressive for a first-time screenwriter, she was ruthless about adapting the book, you know, so she would throw out something, she would move something around, she would combine something in a way that you would have found, like, especially, you know, someone of their first time book, that they would have been a little bit more precious or defensive of those elements. But she was incredibly mercenary about what needed to work as a feature film script. and so sharp about that. And then if we would give her notes, she would sort of hear our dumb executive notes or our dumb notes and be like, okay, I got it. And literally 36 hours later would come back with like a genius, brilliant solution. And like, oh my God, that's kind of what I was trying to articulate, but I can't believe you nailed it. And then just skipping to it also, even once our director came on board, I've never seen, I always say, I've never seen a project that we really liked take such a huge step forward with the supervision and guidance of the director as well, which Jessica did, but just the director talking about how he saw it as a film and her really kind of understanding that and making that, building that scaffolding on the script, so that could exist. It was incredibly impressive.
Yeah, Mike and Jessica really have this amazing synergy. And I remember, in the development with the two of them, we used to have these like 3 to 4 hour Zoom calls where we just went through the script scene by scene by scene. And, Mike, I think, has this really remarkable ability to just drill down on the absolute truth of each scene. And so, his involvement, I think, really helped us sculpt the film even more towards what it is now.
I wasn't in those 3-4 hour sessions. I just want to say that for the record. That's way too long for me. Yeah, and I have a slight anecdote about how that happened, because obviously I've dealt with a lot of authors either adapting or not. And Hannah, it does feel like I get so emotional when I talk about this movie. Mila's like, stop crying every time you talk about the movie. I'm like, I know, it's so emotional. But one of the things when I first started talking to Jess about it is, as some people know, my first job ever was working for, your father, Anthony Minghella, and I gave her his book, Minghella on Minghella. And she quotes that often as the source of, just really, I think, one, our belief in her, but also giving her this guidebook, because, often, as when your dad was adapting, he would read the book and then put it to the side. Now it's hard to say that to a novelist because it's their words, but to Erik's point, she did do that. She kind of took what was working for the purposes of the screenplay, and she was able to kind of separate herself. And so for me, it was so amazing to watch this process. And given I'm talking to p.g.a members, it was not a fast one. Obviously, this took years and years. Not only did those sessions happen with Mike, they happened again when Mila came on board. And, I've worked with a lot of, actors in my day who have been involved very early. The amazing thing about Mila as a producer is she wasn't just looking at what her character was doing. She was looking at the whole picture. And so that became, and for anyone that knows Mila, like the rest of us on this phone call, she doesn't mince her words. We love that. And so Jessica really responded to that. She just she solicited that kind of incredible collaboration and feedback. And with every step, the movie got closer towards, as you've seen it. Hopefully everyone's seen it by this point. It's very complicated juggling, these tones.
I was going to ask you about that, because it really feels like a magic trick, like a sleight of hand, because the film itself is kind of fearless, actually. I think, and Mila, your performance as well, just tackling sexual abuse, tackling gun violence, tackling trauma and the experience that sexual assault, victims of sexual assault experience in reliving that trauma, like in the court of public opinion. And, I was really intrigued, because not only are you dealing with these two timelines, but the fact that you're also dealing with integrating the voiceover, which to me, I loved the juxtaposition between what Arnie was like, what we heard her saying and thinking, and the performance that she was very calculated performance that she was putting on for the rest of the world, and how over the course of the film, that voice becomes one. And so at the end, and one of my favorite moments, not to ruin it for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, is at the very end of the film, when I sort of cheered for her, because she finally says the thing out loud that she would otherwise normally have said in her head, and you cheer for her. And I think it's kind of extraordinary in a film that deals with so much that can be so heavy, that you can find a way to make it so entertaining and accessible, and then have you rooting so deeply for the character to that you're sort of like, hell yeah, at the end when she says what she says. And it really, you are juggling so much, and the film slightly defies, I think, definition in the best kind of way, because it feels so bold and unique. But I'm sure that's partly why it took the time that it took to make. But I'm so glad that it did, because of where it ended up. I realized that what I just said is not a question, which makes it hard for anyone to respond to it. It was a bit of a love letter. But how did you find yourselves? Like, was it a lot in post of really trying to calibrate how much you're leaning into one part of the story versus another?
I think tonally it was throughout the whole process. I mean, we were constantly trying to balance the light and the dark during the writing of the script. And I even remember like our first table read went really well, but we were like, oh, hearing it out loud, you know, I think there's a section midway through the second act that just feels too heavy for too long, and we needed to like lighten it up a little bit. But then, you know, in post, every single cut, it was about like shaving a joke off here, and, you know, we don't need that joke here, and lighten this up here. So it was just like constant fine tuning throughout, I think.
Mila, go ahead.
Well, I was waiting for someone else to speak. Bruna, you're so quiet. No, I was going to say that also the great thing about Jess is in the post, I do want to add that the all the internal dialogue that the character has was rewritten many a times. So the structure was there, the spine was there, but we did finesse the internal dialogue because none of us wanted the dialogue to feel expositionary. Like, we didn't want it to feel like it's a version of pushing the story along. We actually wanted it to be an independent character. And then when we saw one of the many cuts, but the early cut, we realized how great of a character that was. And so I think that through many re-records, we elevated that one voice drastically. And that's to Jess's credit. She did a beautiful job with a lot of rewrites in post.
And she was inventive, but I also think to Mila's credit as an actor, there was so much kind of complexity that she was bringing to the role, even where just on your face, you know, just within a scene. So realizing that, oh, actually the voiceover doesn't have to do heavy lift. We can actually be really spare here because we understand, you know, we always wanted the voiceover to be not on a parallel track, but on a perpendicular track until it kind of like disappear, and it kind of crisscrosses, you know, at the third act. But there was so much that Mila was bringing in, and Kiara as well, you know, in terms of seeing that character, but that we kind of, I think, we used much less voiceover by the finished movie than we had intended at the locked shooting script when we started the movie, because you realize, oh, actually, Mila brought it. You don't need it as much.
Also, you were pointing out the very last piece of dialogue, and since this is a p.g.a. Q&A, I will just point out that the only time that this team strongly disagreed on an edit, whether it should be made or not, I'm not going to say, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. That one line was a big point of contention. And some people on this team wanted that line out, and some people didn't. And the beautiful thing about this entire team is that we all heard each other out. And I have never seen it work like this ever. In 30 years of doing this industry, I've never seen a more respected group of people hearing each other's arguments out. But this one line that you pointed out, Hannah, was a point of contention.
I'm trying to think of why I wanted it. I can't even remember now.
How funny I do.
It must have been me she's talking about. I can be wrong. It was definitely me. Can't remember.
You just mentioned, oh, sorry, Bruna, go ahead.
No, I was going to make a joke. No, listen, you know, it's so funny because, like, you know, again, as people say, what does a producer do? I'm like, well, you know, it's also like part of what we do is choose, you know, great collaborators, right? So in this case, I think actually between Erik and I and Mila and Jeanne, we kind of pulled from like all these amazing people we'd worked with. You know, Alex had done the costumes for me on Big Little Lies. Nancy had worked with Erik and I on a really challenging movie, our editor, Nancy. You know, Sue Jacobs had worked with me multiple times. I'm not sure I didn't put, you know, there was so many conversations and favors because part of the challenge of calibrating that tone is having the best people to execute it. You know, our DP, Colin, oh my God, Colin, you know, massive relationship with Mike Barker, the director. You know, the designer was totally new, but someone we all bonded with immediately, Elisa. So, you know, I don't want to make it a love fest, even though this group really does like each other a lot. But I think to Mila's point, we talked about every decision was discussed along the way, no matter how big or small, because it really all mattered here.
One of the decisions I was going to pick up on, Eric mentioned Chiara, and I thought she was really a kind of revelation in the film. And there was a really interesting, talking about the juxtapositions that exist in the film, there was something so heartbreaking just in the simplicity of seeing, how sort of open and vulnerable her portrayal of her character is, sort of, especially in the run up to her trauma. And then how, in opposition to that, Mila, you play Ani as this incredibly controlling person who has had to kind of build this defense for herself. And even without ever needing to say anything, just cutting between those two storylines and seeing the different approach to who those actors were and how they performed those parts was heartbreaking, right? Like, just to really feel the visceral effect that this trauma has had. And I thought she was wonderful. And it made me wonder, because some of those scenes they are probably traumatic to experience as an actor as well. Like, I'm, in an age where I think as producers, we all think a lot about how do we create environments that feel safe for people, and especially for young people and for young women. I'm just curious sort of what that process was like for all of you. And
yes, to all of that. This is something Mila and I have a joke. She said, "You didn't shop for my stuff," and I go, "Well, it's true." Eric and I actually had to kind of split up the movie. It was right in the middle of COVID, and it was, I think, really important for me, and maybe it's because I am a woman, and to be there for some of that really sensitive stuff that the young kids had to do. And again, we were just really aligned as a group that they needed kind of all the support, not only preparation, but to have, we had psychologists on set standing by, they were always available to them. Obviously, intimacy coordinators, all of that was so important. All of the people we consulted with about the sensitivities around the movie. And yes, again, it wasn't a question, but Chiara and Hannah, I think you said this to me actually when you saw the movie, which really struck me. I was saying this to Mila the other day. The casting, obviously, of Tiffany was so crucial. And we had a lot of conversation about it. And there were people that looked more like Mila, for instance, to play Tiffany. But I think we were all aligned, and particularly driven by our director, Mike Barker, and Mila, that, what Chiara had was this kind of incredible optimism and innocence, which just breaks your heart in the movie. When you cut to Ani and kind of, what the armor she's built up around herself, that turned out obviously to be the most important thing. And it was a real lesson in kind of that conversation and casting. And again, how important all those conversations are.
yeah, absolutely. What are the conversations that you hope people are having when they come out of watching this movie? Because it really is thought-provoking in terms of like where we are at in a society, in our society, and how we treat women who have experienced assault. And I think that's partly why that end moment resonated with me so much, is because I think sometimes, as women, we don't support one another and our stories enough. And Mila, I don't know, like for you taking on this role and sort of, embodying Ani and the sort of freedom that comes from her being able to tell her story finally, and what that means for her. I'm just curious sort of what those conversations are that you hope the film leads to.
I mean, I've made this joke before where I just simply hope that people don't second screen while watching this movie, and then I'll feel like we've all won. I think that the movie speaks for itself, and I think that if we did a good job, which I feel like we did a great job, I think you'll walk away with a little bit more empathy and a little. I know that word is overused, but I mean it in this case, and I hope that people are comfortable enough to ask the uncomfortable questions and talk about this. But you don't want to tell people what to think or how to think or what to say. But I really do think the movie allows itself to open up the door to a multitude of conversations. I also hope that parents watch this and have a conversation with their kids. Like, I mean, there's the post-trauma, and then there's how do you prevent this from happening conversation. And I think both are equally as important. It's a lot about what not to do. and also, giving yourself grace and allowing yourself to heal. And I think that that's something that as society we don't really always allow women in particular time for. And so I hope that this kind of brings that a little bit into perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to steal something Jessica said recently, which stuck with me, which is, that like Ani, she's a very sort of thorny character and she doesn't always, make the right decisions. And I think, she kind of shows that like you don't have to be this perfect, virtuous victim in order to be a victim. And you don't have to be perfect in order for society to recognize that something terrible has happened to you, right? And I think sometimes society can kind of like fetishize what it means to be a victim in a really unhelpful way, when there's really like a wide range of what that can look like for people. And so I hope it sort of provides like a wide map of ways that people can connect with Ani.
And you can't move forward until you kind of face, the past, until you take that time, I think it's interesting. It's even just when you meet Ani in the beginning, she presents one way, and obviously we, if you're a reader book or you're listening to her, the voiceover, you understand that there's a lot more than what you see. And I just always love that kind of character, that has like, there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more complexity. And I think for most of the characters that we see along the way, there's much more than meets the eye, for every one of them in different ways. And I think that's also, I really love that element of this movie.
Yeah, perception versus reality.
Mhm.
I think we're running low on time, but I wanted to just ask, because I know that, I think every movie is its own experience, and I'm sure we all like learn something different from every film that we work on. And I'm just curious, as we wrap up, like, was there one takeaway that you had in the making of this film that sort of you'll carry into all of the next amazing projects that you're all working on?
Well, everyone knows what I'm going to say, don't they? I mean, literally never give up. I mean, that is the biggest takeaway. And we're talking to producers, and it's like this movie has completely kind of restored my faith in, because it can get hard, obviously, that, we've seen other people do it. I have friends, things have taken, up to 20 years. And sometimes we're lucky and it moves like a train, and it just, it's all happening in the time frame it should. This one was not that, but I think for me, certainly it's all the more satisfying because of it, because we did find our way through, because, of these amazing collaborations. So I think for me, that's my biggest takeaway. It's really kind of buoyed me in that sense.
Definitely. I mean, it took 7 years, more than that, actually, when you think about it, like even just from the whole time of working on it. And what is also interesting is that it took many years, many people, the people, us right here, but then also a lot of other people who are beyond. And the subject matter is super intense, right? As you know, but it was such a warm, loving, fun, and silly group dynamic like that I loved, like we definitely, this was like tribe LGA, and I love that. I love the idea that, it did really take more than a village. It took it took a country to, do this, but everyone was kind of working together in the same way and saw the same vision for it, and were super supportive of each other. And we had fun along that way,
I'll piggyback you, Eric. But I also will say, as like new to the project, as far as the timeline goes, I cannot speak more fondly of the team Picture Start and team Made Up Stories. And as somebody who came in at the very end of their 7-year journey, I've never worked with producers who were as open-minded and as eager to educate and invite and make other people feel like their opinion's worthy. Unlike, I mean, Bruna and Erik and Jeanne they should have a master's class on how to be exemplary producers, because you can do hard work and still have fun and be kind and nice and generous. And I do find that oftentimes in our industry, producers, in order to get their job done, are like bulls in the china shop, and they have to peacock in a certain way or be a certain way in order to put forth a certain type of perception in order to get work done. And I've never worked with a team like this who is the polar opposite. It's the most fun, the easiest production I've ever been a part of, with the heaviest of topics. And so as far as a juxtaposition of like making an incredible movie that deals with really hard topics, it could not have been a more welcoming, warm, kind, funny environment to be a part of. So I do want to say thank you to the three of you.
She's gonna make me cry again. See,
I mean,
That's what
I
want.
love that. I feel like that is where we should probably wrap this conversation, except that I would like to say that I tend to agree, and that some of the loveliest people I know in this business are on this Zoom. And I am not going to be able to stay at number one with Lou on it. So I will happily pass that baton to all of you. I hope you have great success with this film. I thought it was wonderful, and thank you for having me here to talk with you all about it today.
Thanks,
you.
Anna.
Thank you.
Yeah.